Okay, we're back again. A warm welcome back it is to all of you who've just joined us to 3AI Storm. And we want to bring to you our opening address speaker. And the keynote is by somebody who wears multiple hats as an author, angel investor, advisor to founders, VCs, mentor at startup accelerators, columnist, and as the chief human resource officer at BigBasket, among many others. Now, he has spent the first 14 years of his career at Tata Steel, mostly as an engineer on the shop floor, with the last 3 years in the area of human capital being restructure the company to helping the company restructure to cope with post-liberalization challenges, and has also spent the last 19 odd years as part of leadership teams of high growth startups in domains as varied as business process outsourcing, information technology, financial services, consumer internet, and e-commerce. And each of these startups saw successful and meaningful exits, with three of them even going on to become unicorns. Yeah, who doesn't love a unicorn these days? In the last 6 years, he has played an active role in shaping the startup ecosystem in the country and is respected as a thought leader and an influencer. Now, he has been a prolific author and has authored 7 books so far. Many of his books have been bestsellers and have provided insights and playbooks to many founders. So I don't think we could have got anybody else better than this gentleman coming up right next as a keynote speaker for all of us. Ladies and gentlemen, give it up for the one, the only CHRO BigBasket, Hari Tien. Over to you, Hari.
Thank you so much, Riaz. I think you've been very, very generous and kind in your introduction. So, first of all, I really would like to thank the organizers for giving me an opportunity, to talk to this respected analytics group, bunch of professionals. And when I was asked to speak, I was wondering what's a good topic to pick for a forum like this. And I noticed that the title of this, so-called conference was Storm. Probably, I think, referring to pandemic and the storm it created for many businesses. So I thought, let me just go back a little bit in history and talk a little bit about some of the crises that helped shape the analytics functions. And let me also share some of my thoughts on the analytics function as well. So I think all of us have heard of, Florence Nightingale. And the image that comes to mind when one hears his name is one of a very compassionate nurse, someone who cared for her patients, who worked very hard to ameliorate the condition of suffering and wounded soldiers in wars. And she was known as the lady with the lamp, the lady who carried the lamp, through the hallways of the hospitals that she worked in the middle of the night, actually checking for patients who needed special care. Maybe some were in pain and needed a dose of morphine or any other kind of attention. That's the image that comes to mind. But what is less known about her is more interesting for this group of people, and that's absolutely amazing. So, the year was 1854, and that was the time in which the great game was being played out in some ways. The great game is still being played out. In fact, in the last century, towards the end of the last century as well, between Russia and the different Western powers for oil. Prior to that, in the middle of the 19th century, Russia was encroaching into Europe, becoming stronger and stronger, and finding ways to even come into a country like India via Afghanistan. And that triggered 3 Anglo-Afghan wars. So that was the time when Russia and the Western world were in many ways in a serious conflict. And the Crimean War was fought between England on one side, along with its allies Turkey and France, and Russia on the other side. So that year was 1854. And at that point of time, Florence Nightingale was deputed to a British hospital in Scutari in Turkey. And that was where a lot of the wounded British soldiers were kept. And when she went to the hospital, she was appalled to see some of the conditions. And she discovered that there was no method at all in the way, data was kept in the hospital about who was being treated, who showed improvement, whose condition was deteriorating, how many were dying. She was absolutely appalled to see that this was the situation. And there was absolutely no hygiene. Kitchen wasn't hygienic, the hospital overall wasn't hygienic, and she was pretty much shocked about this. And she had an orientation for data, orientation for numbers, and she had a small team which helped her put together this wonderful data that led her to quickly conclude that 10 times more soldiers were dying of dysentery, cholera, typhoid, and other preventable illnesses as compared to wounds from war. So the three terrible D's, which is diet, dirt, and drains, was actually killing the soldiers. And what she did was she found innovative ways of collecting data, processing it, visualizing the data, and presenting this. Once she did this, she was able to convince the British government to initiate a lot of these measures. So, very interestingly, some of the common ways in which we present data today, whether they are bar charts or coxcomb charts, histograms, any kind of data visualization tools that we use, were in some ways actually figured out by and used very extensively by Florence Nightingale. She got the British government to, keep the kitchen clean after that. She got special teams from the UK to help her improve sanitation very significantly. And she also collected data to show that after all these measures were initiated, there was a very significant reduction in the number of deaths in the hospital. And that was absolutely amazing pioneering work in the 1850s, middle of the 19th century. She was the first woman member who was elected as a member of the Royal Statistical Society. And she went on to become an honorary member of the American Statistical Association as well. So it said, while she literally walked the halls of the hospital with a lamp in the hand, figuratively, actually, she brought light to the power of data in crisis. So I think crisis has a way of, bringing out the best in some individuals. And a crisis is a time when you can use a lot of data to figure out what the right kind of actions are. Otherwise, you just go with a point of view that cannot be substantiated with data, and that's not necessarily the right thing to do. I'll talk subsequently about how British Airways, looked at analytics and used the power of analytics. One more story from a very similar era, similar time, which is during the Crimean War. So between 1846 and 1860, there was a global pandemic. And this was a cholera pandemic. It affected most parts of the world, including the UK. Thousands of people, actually hundreds of thousands of people died in this epidemic. And two physicians actually became famous as a result of, at this point of time, by doing some pioneering work. One was a British doctor by name John Snow, and the second was a Hungarian doctor by name Ignaz Semmelweis. So both of them were known to have, propagated the idea that hygiene is an important element of cure at hospitals for patients. And remember that this was the time when Robert Koch had not yet, put forth his theory of germs. So people never knew that there existed these invisible things called germs, which were killers. And Ignaz Semmelweis had a very difficult time convincing people, his colleagues in the hospitals, that these invisible things, and we don't know what they are possibly killing a lot of patients. And many pregnant women during childbirth were actually dying in hospitals because of unhygienic conditions. And it was not at all uncommon for doctors in those days to actually do an autopsy and without washing their hands go and perform a different kind of a surgery. Invariably, people died, and there were hundreds and thousands of deaths. And it was these two doctors who pushed for the idea of hygiene. And they asked that simple washing of hands between different, at different parts of the day and before performing critical surgeries or operations can actually reduce fatality rates. Washing your hands with chlorine and other disinfectants. And they collected data to show that there was a very strong correlation between hygiene and patient mortality rate. So some of these were just so amazing because germ theory was not yet known, and these doctors figured this out. And London was also very seriously hit by cholera at this point of time, and nobody knew what exactly cholera was. They called it the miasma theory, and a lot of disease was attributed to miasma, which is dirty air. And that was the prevalent theory in terms of what really caused major diseases. But John Snow, went around London, talked to multiple, residents in different areas, and figured out that it was the source of water in some of these localities that was causing cholera. And And by shutting down some of the pumps and water sources and bringing came down dramatically. So sometimes it's quite obvious at this point of time. If you look back, it seems so elementary, but imagine in those times when you had to figure out correlations between actions which seemingly had no relationship with the outcomes. Washing hands at a time when there was no germ theory, how do you even believe that there is a relationship between of that to patient fatalities and cholera and the water sources? And miasma theory is very interesting. What some of the doctors had discovered at that point of time was that if you kept people and those who lived in closed homes where there was filtered air circulated without outside air coming in, patients did not, individuals did not suffer from malaria. So they thought that this miasma theory is actually confirmed. So they concluded wrongly. And in analytics, we always, try to establish cause effect. And we need to be very careful in establishing cause and effect because most of the times in organizations, you find a very hasty conclusion about cause and effect without proper analysis. And they reached the conclusion that dirty air was responsible for malaria. Actually, what was happening was that when the homes were shut and air was circulated through filters, it was not clean air that prevented malaria. It was the inability of mosquitoes to get into these houses that actually malaria. So there are a lot of lessons here in terms of establishing correlations, and obviously analytics has advanced a great deal from those times. But some of the problems that we still grapple with are very, very elementary, and I might talk a little bit about that. So I think advancements in technology, data storage, and computing power have only made the use of data and analytics extremely compelling for everyone. And in 2008, in the middle of the big financial crisis, when British Airways was thinking of cutting costs, was going through major cost cutting exercise, they decided not to do anything with the analytics team. They maintained the analytics team. They did not do any cost cutting there. They did not lay off anybody. And the reason was that they believed if you had to rationalize cost in an objective way, if you have to become frugal in a very objective way, then you need analytics. You need to look at data. Only then can you figure out what to cut. Otherwise, you will end up cutting muscle. So they were smart enough to realize that, the analytics team at that point of time during this crisis, this was the team that will help them get out of the crisis. So there are so many stories about, crisis and how analytics function helped, people fight the crisis with data, facts, and meaningful rational correlations. In countries like, US, California, and Australia, where there's a lot of dry foliage and huge bushfires, use of satellite imagery and data to identify vulnerable hotspots and high risk zones have been able to help firefighters in advance, trigger to help them trigger the right kind of actions so as to prevent crime rather than focus on prevent some of these major fires, or at least reduce some of the damage. And today a lot of the crime prevention is being enabled by analytics. So people are moving against crime, bringing criminals to justice to actually prevention of crime. And geeks and data scientists are now working shoulder to shoulder with hardened cops and investigators to help them prevent crime rather than focus on bringing criminals to justice. And I would just say, finally, many times this is something that I've very intuitively felt, even while I sit through many presentations, when analytics teams make presentations, many other situations. I've realized that, crises are complex in nature. They will need judicious use of data, but I think human judgment and expert knowledge is needed to navigate them. While you can't run a business today without data, but you can run a business without human judgment. but you also can't let the numbers drive the car. And I think this is something analytics professionals really need to appreciate. And many of them obviously sense and an ability to ask the right kind of questions. And I've also seen this, and this is true for every profession, which is an expert profession. An expert profession, I mean, a profession that requires you to go very deep in that profession to be able to acquire a certain level of competence to be able to perform. So, for instance, human resources, I would say, is not a particularly deep profession because you don't need that professional surgery, for example, technology. These are areas where you need to go extremely deep to be able to perform as an expert. And one thing I've noticed is that experts can sometimes go terribly wrong. And I would call this the curse of knowledge. And I've seen this multiple times, which is that the more familiar you are with something, the harder it is to put yourself in the shoes of someone who is not familiar with it and explain it in a way that is demystified to the layman. As a result of which, many of these professionals, expert professionals, tend to overuse jargon, tend to believe a lot more in the tools and techniques of their profession rather than, rely on human judgment, rely on intuition. And I would call this the curse of an expert. So I think for great analytics professionals, for great any expert professionals, I think it's important to blend data with analysis and with the tools of their profession. In the absence of this, I think you can go all over the place and reach wrong conclusions. I've seen this multiple times that if you bring human judgment, if you have a sense, hypothesis of what is happening, then you're able to solve the problem better using data. But if you have no sense of what is happening, no intuition about what should be happening or what could be the problem, then if you blindly rely on data, it's unlikely to tell you the right kind of things. And all of us fall, prey to several logical fallacies. And logical fallacies with data are so many of them. One is a survivor bias. All of us have heard of the idea of a survivor bias, using survivors to generalize conclusions. So one story, very famous one, is during World War II. So US armed forces were looking at planes that were shot down by anti-aircraft fire, and they were trying to analyze, which parts of the plane need to be reinforced with armor. And they were looking at planes that had returned to the base and were looking at where were the bullets shot, anti-aircraft bullets. And then after analyzing the patterns, they figured out where they need to reinforce. But then there was a very well-known statistician by name Abraham Wald, who figured out that, you're looking at planes that returned to the base and not looking at planes that were shot down. And probably the planes that were shot down were shot in places that were very different from those that returned to the base. Those that returned to the base were shot at places which were not fatal, whereas those that crashed or were shot down were shot at places that were fatal. So, say days people used to live very long. It's not true at all because lifespans have increased, but the statement is being made on the basis of looking at a few people who have lived very long. You may have seen people who are 100 years, and you generalize based on the survivor bias that life in those days people lived long lives. So these are some of the common things, and seem very elementary, but then I found that from time to time everyone, including the experts, I think fall prey to this. So let me not spend too much more time, I think, giving gyan. I think this is just an absolutely, amazing audience. I feel very humbled, very privileged to be able to talk to all of you. And I don't even know that I'm competent to talk, but therefore very happy. And I found that if you go through history, you will always find that every crisis has had multiple saviors, and invariably in every situation, analytics played a very important role. And when it came to BigBasket, after the pandemic, we had a problem to solve, and that was a very good problem to solve, which is that the demand went through the roof, and we had no capacity to service the demand. Demand went up significantly, and our capacity came down significantly. So we had to improvise, we had to improvise, significantly. So how do you serve these customers? So we just fell back on data. We looked at so much of data, and to help us figure out, that many customers were, existing customers were coming to our website able to find slots because some new customers were able to get slots. So when we figured that out, we began giving priority to existing customers. Then we realized that assortment needed to be cut down significantly because nobody cared for 40,000 SKUs. Your assortment of 40,000 SKUs didn't mean anything. We had to bring it down to 1,500 essential SKUs that could be delivered with a lot of reliability. Again, we used, historic data and other data to figure what should be the assortment of 1,000, 1,500, which are absolutely essential. How did we introduce a token system where slots were not available? Again, data layers to the right kind of things. So I would say that every crisis, analytics and data sciences have played a very important role. And I take an amateurish interest in analytics. And therefore, for me, it's a great privilege to be able to speak here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Hari, for sharing all those nuggets of knowledge, if I can call them. And it's such a pleasure to hear you speak. What a prolific author you are, and of course, you are somebody who's championed the cause of making unicorns, of course, of all the startups that you've mentored and been part of personally as well.
We may have lost Riaz.
No, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Thank you, Hari. Is everybody else? You can use the chat box, guys, of course, to give your inputs as well. You can use the chat box to message if you can hear Hari, hear me. Yes, they said they can hear me. Okay, so yes, thank you so much, Hari, once again for being here. Really appreciate your time. I think a busy gentleman like you sparing some time for all of us is something really amazing. Thank you, sir. We really appreciate you. Please enjoy the rest of the evening and have a great life ahead, sir. Okay.